So this morning, we have Peter's confession. The word confession means to declare. Much like last week when the Canaanite woman said, "Lord, Son of David." Remember how I asked you all to hang on to that thought? And in particular, what makes Peter's confession so different than the Canaanite woman's? Well, as it happens, Matthew provides us the key this morning. The account of Peter's confession occurs in 3 of the 4 Gospels. The most ancient of these, of course, is Mark, the first Gospel. And it is a little different than what we have in Matthew this morning. So bear with me. I'm going to read a little portion from Mark. It's very short, right? But perhaps you could open your service booklet and read along in Matthew while I read Mark. And perhaps even if you wanted to go a little bit further, you could underline where it's different in Matthew. It's a very short exercise, but it might show you something. And so what I'll do is I'll read the story as it's portrayed in Mark, and you can just follow along in Matthew. You may have to skip around a bit. Mark writes, Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist," and others, "Elijah," and still others, "one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone. Do you see some of the differences there? There's quite a few, right? The locating of this event in Caesarea Philippi is significant for us to understand. Caesarea Philippi was an entirely Hellenistic city. It was Greek, right? All in all. And it was the furthest north that Jesus ever traveled in his ministry. It was in the area or the territory known as Bashan, beyond what was known as Galilee. And so you can interpret that in a couple of ways, but for our purposes here, I think we are to interpret that as beyond the boundaries of what was known. This is beyond Galilee. This is beyond Jesus' region, right? And that is where he takes his disciples to ask them the question of who do people say that I am, and who do you believe that I am? Beyond what was known. The popular recognition that Jesus was either John the Baptist reborn, or Elijah, or in Matthew's case, if you notice the difference, as Jeremiah, all interpret Jesus as fulfilling the prophecies about the forerunner of the Messiah, right? Those are the people who are to come before the Messiah to prepare his way. These expectations are firmly rooted in the Old Testament that we know, that Bill read so great today, right? And so you could say in short that many of Jesus' inner circle apparently considered him to be a prophet who could be preparing the way for the true Messiah who is yet to come. So remember the Canaanite woman's "Lord, Son of David"? That was hinting at that. Son of David is code, right, for Messiah. But here's where it differs. When Jesus asked his disciples who he is, it was Peter, the first of his inner circle, to make this significant leap when he says, in effect, "We do not think as others think. I do not think as others do. But you are the Messiah himself." This is what he says in Mark's gospel, right? You are the Messiah. In the English, the word Messiah comes from the Hebrew, which means anointed. And in Greek, you probably know that as Christos, right? Jesus, the Christ. In the Old Testament, Messiah was sort of never used as a title, but sort of reflected who the person was. And we know from later Jewish writings that the expectation of the coming of that Messiah was very common in the Jews of Jesus' day. However, since the anointing that happens in the Jewish tradition is only that of the anointing of a king, of a person, of someone flesh and blood, that demonstrates that the hope for the Messiah was in fact a person who was a political figure or perhaps a military figure. And there is no evidence that the Jews ever expected their hope-for Messiah to be divine in any way. And in fact, some scholars that you read in seminary would go so far as to say that that idea would have probably been repugnant to some of the Jews of the day, given the fact that they were staunch monotheists, right? You remember Moses, right? The Shema of Israel. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, the only Lord." This is way before the idea of the Trinity, right? And perhaps that is why Jesus follows Peter's declaration with immediately warning them not to tell anyone, since it's probably going to be misunderstood. So therefore, according to Mark, Peter's acknowledgement of Jesus as the Messiah is not, I think, in itself to be understood as that Jesus was in any way divine yet. However, that brings us to the gospel today, Matthew, where you probably noticed that Peter added something to his declaration that is extremely significant. Not only does Peter say, "You are the Messiah," but what does he add? "You are the Son of the living God." Peter is making an altogether different claim there. That in fact, the Jesus that is with them and before them is God himself, incarnate. That is Peter's confession. And if you want to say something more, that is the church's confession. Problems sort of arise for us if Matthew's added verse that "on this rock I will build my church" is applied to Peter personally, right? Jesus didn't build his church on Peter the man. The church fathers never interpreted it that way. The rock, for them and for us, is Peter's confession that Jesus is Lord. That is what the church is built upon. Not Peter the man, but Peter's confession that Jesus is the Lord. Peter's confession is not yet a full-blown statement of faith like what we say in the creed today, right? The Nicene Creed. It's not a full dogmatic statement of what we believe. But today is a radical beginning place in the ministry of Jesus. And it took, I think, a lot of courage and love for Peter to speak in such a radical way. And I think if we are to take away anything, it's that the church was not built upon Peter the man, but his confession that Jesus is the true Son of God. Moreover, I think it's important for us to think or to remember that Peter's confession should give us strength to make our own confession. And so here's a story about that. No doubt you've been following along in our prayers as we've been praying for Janice Lonsky, Janice and Robert. Last week, Janice was admitted to Jane Phillips, and it became clear sort of in those late hours of the day that she was in severe trouble. And so the hospitalist that was in the room saw what was going on in her body and told her husband that most likely we would have to intubate, right, to get her breathing under control. And as sort of like an observation, he looked at Robert and he said, if I do this, she's probably not going to come off of that. And he looked right at Robert, and I'm sort of in the back, and he says, I'm going to go confer with another doctor, but you have about 5 minutes. And so say what you need to say. "20 years of marriage. You got 5 minutes. Say what you need to say." You know, and you prepare for this, right, in your ministry, and you always like, you know. But when it happens, and you're standing next to a man who's 3 times your size, and you're trying to hold him up, it gets real really fast. So I thought to myself, like, am I ready? Could I say that to Teresa right now? Could I tell her everything that she means to me in 5 minutes? And so I'm holding on to this guy, and he looks right at his wife, and he says, "You are my everything. And I love you." And if you know Janice, man, she's got these eyes that can look straight through you, right? And see your heart. And so she's looking at Robert, and then she gives me kind of the side eye. I think kind of checking to see if this was really real. And in that moment, you just hold on. And I thought to myself, whatever is bound here on earth will be bound in heaven. And if Janice is Robert's forever and everything, thanks be to God.